Hello and welcome to this video on the Gospel of Luke. Again, these are videos with introductory material for participants in the Campus Commonwealth Academy and MTA session meeting in January of 2014. Let's begin some material on the Gospel of Luke. It is believed that this was written, of course, by Luke, otherwise known as Luke the physician, who was apparently, from his kind of first-person plural references in the book of Acts, was a missionary companion of perhaps the Apostle Paul and other disciples of Jesus during that early period in the church. Now, to consider Luke a physician and therefore liken Luke to a doctor, an MD of the present period is slightly misleading. Luke was most likely, perhaps he knew something about anatomy and of perhaps other approaches to healing people's bodies, or even terapia, as the term would have been considered. But he was probably a very educated man, perhaps educated in at the level of the elite of the time, something perhaps of a specialist in the quote-unquote life sciences, just someone who was very broadly learned and could write well. Luke is perhaps the most sophisticated linguistically of all the Gospels, and it may very well be the case that Theophilus, the name that he mentions at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, was a benefactor, someone who had commissioned him to write this Gospel for Gentile, or primarily Gentile congregations who had heard and seen the faith of Christians, of course, in action, those that they had met in their own cities, and wanted to have a tangible written account of the life of this man Jesus of Nazareth, and everything that they would have seen and read, of course, beforehand, or I should say seen beforehand in the lives of the people who they met, is all of this revolutionary change of people's lives and hearts through the Spirit. So to preserve that, I think it makes sense that Luke would have been called upon to share this writing with members of Gentile communities, especially those that would otherwise perhaps be considered elites or higher status members. But again, it was probably written either just before the death of Paul, perhaps somewhere just after the end of the book of Acts when Paul is still in house arrest, or later on, perhaps just after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70s. Those who do work in this area seem to be divided between those two dates. The emphases of the Gospel of Luke, I'll kind of just sandwich it all together with content, is that first and foremost, the content is there's quite a bit that it shares, of course, with Mark, the earliest Gospel. It shares somewhat with Matthew as well, and with Q. But there's a section in Luke from chapter 12 to 19 that's called the special section, Luke's special section has quite a bit of material that's unique to the Gospel of Luke. And quite a bit of this actually has to do with
economics, possessions, wealth, which probably doesn't come as a surprise considering that Luke places an emphasis on the lowly, the poor, the dispossessed, or the underprivileged, so to speak, more than any other writer in the Gospels. You see it just right away in Luke chapter 4 with Jesus' right quoting of Isaiah 61 verse 1. It was the year of the Lord's favor, the year of the release. Release actually being a term that specifically in the Hebrew Scriptures usually meant the release of debts or anyone who was burdened. Perhaps burdened by crippling debt and desperate to find a new life. This was something that the prophet spoke against, and that Jesus revives in quoting Isaiah 61 verse 1 in his hometown synagogue. And we know, of course, that leads to some displeasure or initially amazement among his peers and his neighbors, but once he starts to elaborate on the fact that God was now acting in such a way that would remind us of the prophet right? Elijah who went out to visit the widow of Zarephath and heal her son, or it's the 2 Kings 5 account of Elisha with Naaman, and he basically tells a message that God is going to act, but you cannot assume that you have the inside track to God's blessings as God's covenant people. You must stay humble, attentive, alert, and active in your faith. And when they heard that, they were not happy. But this emphasis, right, on the lowly is there at the beginning. It's there on even Mary's Magnificat, right, her song about how God is going to reverse the fortunes of the people. And that theme runs through the entire Gospel of Luke, is the great reversal of fortune. There's also an emphasis on women and the Holy Spirit that's very unique as well. The women who are mentioned, of course, the famous Martha and Mary story, the other mentions of women who accompanied Jesus and provided support for him. It's clear from Luke's Gospel, along with the companion volume in Acts, that quite a bit of women were already involved in the fellowship of Jesus and in that messianic community, and that continues on through all the Gentile churches as well. Again, the recipients were elite, most likely, but mixed, and probably quite a distance from Jerusalem, and was meant to sustain these stories for them. The structure is very interesting as well, right? It has some very powerful and even detailed content on the birth and the child, right? And some accounts of the childhood of Jesus before it then skips over to his dwelling in the region of the Jordan in chapter 3, verse 3. Then in chapter 4 it says he's gone out to the wilderness and where he battles Satan, right, where he's again treading the path of his people in the desert. Then later on, of course, and he's back in Nazareth, as I mentioned before, from verse 16 to verse 30, and there he commits his first public act, and then seems to not ever return there in that gospel. He then moves on to Galilee, the region of Galilee, there, and he engages in a slew of healings and engages in conflicts. He recruits probably more followers and more disciples and apprentices. And then once you get to Luke 9, verse 51, it says he set his face to Jerusalem. You very much get a picture of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, of someone who is going after their purpose, who is living to proclaim a message of renewal, a message that everyone ought to hear, and that will reverse the situations that people live in. He eventually gets there, I think in Luke 19, verse 28. And of course the Gospel of Luke has some very profound teachings on discipleship. In fact, discipleship is addressed from a number of different angles. There's first right, teachings from Jesus about his own self, about the person who you are following. Secondly, it's also teachings about discipleship, what is needed. Of course, the familiar passages from Luke 9 and Luke 14 come to mind. Then there's also just teachings or situations where Jesus models it's kind of right discipleship through first-hand experience, through actual immersion in life. Perhaps the most effective way of teaching, this teaching by apprenticeship. That's also there. So these three things are always emphasized in the teachings on discipleship. The teachings, right, of disciples in a world that's being turned upside down, and fortunes are being reversed. Interestingly enough, right, in Luke 4, there's the references to the widow of Zarephath and Naaman. Well, when we get to Luke 7, Jesus is actually initiating that same prophetic ministry almost in reverse, right? Luke depicts that one account of Jesus and the centurion, and commending the centurion for his faith. Very similar to the engagement with Naaman, an elite man whose faith also was challenged and rose to the occasion. And then, of course, as we know, Elijah healed the widow of Zarephath's son, and Jesus himself, right, approaches the widow at Nain and raises her son. So Jesus again is almost replicate. He's treading this path to revive the people's hope, to revive all of our desires to break through
the usual boundaries. And that gives us some basic idea of the Gospel of Luke.